In today's lesson, we're going to look at political apportionment. According to Article 1, Section 2 of our United States Constitution, every 10 years we are required to take a census or a counting. That counting is mainly used to determine how many members of Congress each state is allotted. Now, in the last lesson, we talked about voting weight and things of that nature. So it makes sense that whoever owns more of a company should have more of a say in how that company is run. Well, the same is partially true with the United States. The more a state it has in population, the more say they should have in the way our federal government runs. And that's kind of the idea of this political apportionment. So we determine the number of members of Congress based on a state's population in relationship to the other states. So if you recall, we have in each state 2 representatives in the Senate. Our founding fathers decided that they didn't want the whole population to be governed by perhaps one state or one select group. And so they decided that every state should have 2 members in the Senate to represent them so that every state, regardless of size, regardless of population, has equal representation. At the other point, they also understood that the more populous states should have more of a say in the way the federal government is run. And so they came up with another house, and the number of congressmen in the House of Representatives is based off of the state's population. So if there are 2 senators for each state, that would give us a total of 100 senators. How many representatives are from each state? Well, it varies. We have some states that only have 1. We have other states that have as many as 53.
Now, these numbers change periodically from year to year depending on the census. For instance, if you look on the left-hand graph, you will see that California has 47 electoral votes, whereas Florida has 21. However, looking on the right-hand side, which is the Electoral College from 2010 to 2020, you see that California increased to 55 and Florida increased to 29. Several other states either stayed the same or even decreased. So, for instance, Montana went from 4 in 1980s down to 3 in the 2010s. And there are many others that adjusted slightly.
In the year 2020, we did another census. So the total that we have then is always going to remain 435. 435 members in the House. But the number that each state receives does change periodically. Roughly every 10 years, it has the opportunity to change based on the U.S. Census. The electoral vote, the Electoral College, is representative of all of the states plus Washington, D.C. So we have 100 senators, we have 435 members of the House, and then we have 3 representatives to represent the Washington, D.C. area. So that gives us a total of 538. In an election, whoever wins the majority of those 538 electoral votes is deemed the winner of the general election. So the founding fathers were wise in realizing that the majority or any one state should not always get their way. The minority should have a voice. Now, this is very interesting because the whole purpose of the Electoral College is to allow those minorities a greater voice. But yet, in 2016, when the majority of the voters felt like they did not get their representative in the White House, they were very upset. And it was interesting because many of those people were, quote unquote, part of the minorities as far as their skin color or their race or whatever you want to call it. But yet the Electoral College was made specifically for that purpose so that the minorities would have a voice, and it worked exactly the way the founding fathers wanted it to work. Now, there are a lot of people that says, oh, we don't need any more, we ought to just go based off of populace, but that is a bad idea. Our founding fathers did not want the majority of the people to always rule. If you get the majority, then the minorities start getting hounded upon and ostracized and made fun of, and their rights start being taken away. It's very important that the minority does have a voice. Now, 2016 was not the only time that the majority lost. In fact, in 1824, John Quincy Adams won with 10.5% fewer votes than Andrew Jackson. There were 4 people running at the time, and the election was actually decided by the House of Representatives. It was not even decided by the Electoral College. In 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes won by 1 electoral vote, but had 250,000 fewer votes than Tilden. In 1888, just 12 years later, Benjamin Harrison won with 90,000 fewer votes over Grover Cleveland. In 2000, George W. Bush won with over 500,000 fewer votes than Al Gore. That one was also greatly contested. And then, of course, most recently in 2016, Donald Trump won with 2.9 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. But yet the Electoral College worked the way it was supposed to work. Now, a lot of people say, well, I don't think it's fair. Why don't we just go by popular vote? Well, I heard this analogy used, and so I'm going to go ahead and take it. It is not original to me. But let's take the World Series, right? The World Series, best of 7 games. Whoever wins the most of 7 games wins the World Series. Now, I'm going to go back to 2002 and use that as an example. In the 2002 World Series, these were the following scores. In the first game, San Francisco beat Anaheim 4-3. But they lost in the second game 10-11. They also lost in the third game 4-10. They won the fourth game. Game 4 was 4-3. Game 5 was 16-4. Game 6 was 5-6, and Game 7 they lost 1-4. So who won the World Series in this particular case? Well, naturally, everybody sees, well, Anaheim won 4 of the games, San Francisco won 3. Therefore, Anaheim won this World Series, and indeed they did. However, who scored the most runs? If we count up the number of runs that San Francisco made, we get a total of 44, whereas Anaheim only scored 41. So who should have won the World Series? Should it have been Anaheim, who scored fewer runs? Or should it have been San Francisco, who scored more runs? Well, if you go by the number of runs, San Francisco should have won. However, the World Series is not based off of who scored the most runs. It's based off of who won the most games. The same is true of our Electoral College. It's not a matter of who wins the most votes in the populace, but rather who wins the most electoral votes. This was designed so that one state would not run the entire nation. They wanted equal distribution of the voting power to these different states. They didn't want the candidates to focus on California or to focus on New York or to focus on Florida or to focus on some of these bigger states that have more electoral votes or have a higher populace. Instead, they wanted even the smaller states that have a fewer in their population, to be represented. They wanted to feel as though those states were also important, because they are. And so they came up with this idea of the Electoral College in order to help those minorities, those smaller states, in the election process, to have them have more of a voice. Now, how do they come up with the number of representatives based on population? Well, That has changed several times throughout our nation's history. Representatives are determined partially on the state's population in relationship to the rest of the country. But that's not the entire way that it works. So let's start off with the process. The first thing that we need to do in order to figure out how many each state gets as representatives is find what we call the people per representative rate. There are always 435 members in the House. And so what we do is we take the entire population of the United States. In 2010, that population was a little over 309 million people. And then we divide by how many representatives there are in the House, which is 435. So when we do that, we get roughly 710,000 people per representative. That means it takes roughly 710,000 people to get one member in the House. However, obviously we can't have partials coming from one state and partials coming from another state. So we have to do some sort of rounding or some sort of change in order to get that number to be correct. So what we do is we take the population per state and we divide by the people per representative rate, that number. So for instance, in Florida in 2010, we had almost 19 million people in the state of Florida. Out of those 19 million people, we would need to then divide by the 710,000 number, the people per representative rate. And when we do that, we get 26.59. So Florida in 2010 should have had 26.59 representatives, but obviously we can't have a partial representative. So how do we split up those weird numbers? Well, like I said, it has changed several times throughout history. From 1790 to 1830, we used what is called the Jefferson Method. The Jefferson Method, first of all, started by calculating the exact values and then rounding down. So in the process of Florida, for instance, since Florida would have 26.59 representatives, then we would round down. So instead of having 26.59, we would have 26. We would always round down. We would then find the sum of all the representatives from all the states following that same process. If it's less than 435, we would revise the number of people per representative until the sum of the whole numbers of the representatives matches the total number of the U.S. representatives. So what that means is that we would say, instead of 710,000, we are going to go down a little bit and we'll say 700,000. So if we round down that number and we say 700,000, let's rework all of the numbers and find out if that total ends up being 435 when we round down. And they would continue to adjust that number until they came up with 435. Now, keep in mind that during this time in our history, from 1790 to 1830, we did not have very many states. So it was not a big deal to continually be working these numbers over and over again until it worked out. But as we started adding more and more states, you could see how encumbersome that would be. It would start taking a long time. It would take a very long time doing 50 states. And so because of this encumbersome method, they decided that we really need to find another way. And that brought up the Adams method. Now, the Adams method was never used. It was just discussed. But it's basically the same as the Jefferson method, except for instead of rounding down, you round up. And so in that case, you would also need to round up your people per representative number until you found out that you had 435 members once you added it up. So it didn't really save them any time, but it was an option that was discussed by founding fathers as they came about that time period. The Hamilton method was used from 1850 to about 1900. What they did is they calculated the theoretical number of representatives each state was entitled, such as in Florida, the 26.59. They would round down to the integer. Again, they just would basically truncate it, so they'd knock off the decimal portion. They would find the sum, which obviously was going to be less than 435. Then what they would do is they would find who had the highest fractional part of a whole. So for instance, if a state had, 5.98, well, that 0.98 was much higher than Florida's 0.56. And so they would take whoever had that highest fractional part of a representative and add one to that state. And then they would go to the next highest one and add one to that state. And then keep on going down until they reached a total of 435. This obviously made it much, much easier, much, much faster. You only had to do your calculations once, and then you went through and looked and said, okay, let's take these. Who has the highest? We need 5 more representatives. So who has the highest fractional part? Okay, well, it's Montana. So we're going to add one to Montana. And the next one is, well, it's Delaware. So we're going to add one to Delaware. And they kept on going until they reached their 5 that they have awarded, bringing them up to a total of 435. The Huntington Hill method is what is presently being used. Now, in order to do this one, there is a lot more work to it. However, we must also note that most of this is now done by computer. And so we can get a little bit more fair because our calculations are not nearly as encumbersome, even if they're difficult calculations. We simply write a program that does this. In fact, I have done this using an Excel spreadsheet. I have designed the Excel spreadsheet to determine the number of representatives each state should have based on those numbers. With the Huntington Hill method, what you first do is you calculate the proportional representative for each state. And you're going to round, but this time you round both up and down. So you come up with 2 numbers. So as an example, let's say one state had 6.757 representatives that they were supposed to be awarded. We would round down to 6 and we would round up to 7. Then we take and calculate the geometric mean of those values. Now, the geometric mean is when you take the 2 numbers, you multiply them together, and then take the square root. So we take 6 times 7, which we get 42. We then take the square root of 42, and that gives us roughly 6.48. If the proportional representative that we figured out in this example was 6.757, is greater than our geometric mean, which in our example is 6.48, then we would round up. If it was the opposite, if that geometric mean was higher than the actual representative rate, then we would round down. That process would be used for all of the different states. And then what they would do is if they did not come up with 435, they would adjust the people per representative rate until it worked out. What this does for us is it makes it much more fair to states, because if a state has a population that is lower, therefore they would tend to have fewer representatives, well, they are more likely to gain one of the representatives, because in order to get a partial per representative rate, they don't need as high of a population. And so they're more likely to get that extra representative in their state than some of the larger states that are already well represented in our government. And so this really allows more of a voice for those smaller states, those minority states. And here in America, that is one of the things that we are well known for. We want the minorities. We want those people who seemingly don't have a voice to have a voice. If we get rid of the Electoral College, what we are basically going to do is we are going to rip away voice to minorities. And it's exactly the opposite of what America really wants. And so I hope this lesson was helpful for you. I know it wasn't a whole lot of math as far as learning new material. It's more of a knowledge type of thing. But I want us all to understand the basis of our country and how it was founded and why they have certain things. In this particular lesson, the Electoral College. It's vital to the way our country runs. And we don't need to get rid of it. And in fact, it does use math. It uses quite a bit of math. I hope this was not only interesting, but also more informative to you as you go through life and as you hear things talked on the media and in conversation about the Electoral College and wanting to get rid of it.